It's funny to think that humanity's greatest invention might have started as someone refusing to let lightning have all the fun. Picture this. 1,000,000 years ago, somewhere in the Pleistocene, a group of nervous bipeds is staring at a burning tree. The air smells like roasted grass and terror. One brave ancestor inches closer, holding a stick like a child poking at a sleeping snake. The branch catches fire, and just like that, curiosity becomes destiny and, possibly, barbecue. At sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found charred bones and ash layers nearly 2 million years old, proving that early humans weren't just accidentally setting things on fire, they were learning to keep it alive. Fire wasn't discovered once, it was negotiated, again and again, between fear and fascination. You could almost call it a bad relationship. Humanity couldn't live without it, but it could definitely die because of it. Back then, fire didn't come from lighters or flint. It came from luck. A lightning strike, a volcanic spark, maybe the wrath of the gods before gods even had names. And when that rare miracle appeared, people gathered like moths at a sacred concertical parts, hypnotized and terrified. Staying near the fire meant warmth, light, protection from things with sharper teeth, and more importantly, my fire pushed back the night. It let people see each other after sunset, which, considering their grooming habits, was probably a mixed blessing. Once fire entered human life, everything else began to orbit around it. The diet changed first. Meat stopped being a dental hazard and became dinner. Cooked food meant more energy and less chewing, an evolutionary 2-for-1 deal that gave humans the time and brain power to think about more complicated things, like gossip and existential dread. Ashes even became an early kind of toothpaste. Romantic. Really nothing says intimacy like two hominins sharing a burnt antelope and some abrasive minerals. But mastering fire wasn't a one-time event. It was maintenance. You couldn't just light it and walk away. If it went out, you were back to freezing, scavenging, and praying for another thunderstorm. In those early camps, someone had to stay awake, guarding the embers through wind and rain. The first night watch was probably less heroic and more miserable: smoke in the eyes, mosquitoes in the ears, and the constant dread that a single mistake could kill everyone. Even so, fire was worth it. It turned dangerous wilderness into something faintly domestic. It made caves habitable and nights bearable. It stitched together the fragile social fabric that would one day become humanity's idea of home. When archaeologists sift through Paleolithic ashes, they find not just burnt bones, but the first traces of companionship, people who sat, talked, and maybe argued by the light of a flame that none of them understood but all of them needed. And yet, the story doesn't stop there. Because the moment fire became part of human life, it also became part of human responsibility. Someone had to feed it, shield it, keep it breathing. The embers had to be coaxed like children, tended like livestock, protected like secrets. It couldn't be left alone, not even for a night. Because soon enough, fire stopped being a lucky accident, became a daily duty. Long before anyone could brag about mastering fire, most people were just trying not to lose it. Fire-making was an exaggeration for several 100,000 years. What our ancestors really did was fire babysitting around-the-clock panic, that the universe's only source of warmth might sneeze itself out. In the Dark Ages before matches, if your flame died, so did your mood, your dinner, and possibly your entire social circle. Archaeological evidence from lower Paleolithic sites shows hearths carefully arranged, with layers of ash and burnt material indicating continuous use. That means someone, probably several someones, had to stay up all night, prodding embers and mumbling early versions of "Don't You Dare Go Out." It wasn't glamorous work. Imagine a prehistoric night shift, freezing wind outside, everyone snoring, and you sitting cross-legged beside the glow. Smoke stinging your eyes, trying to look holy while mostly just trying to stay awake. Keeping fire alive required skill. Too much wood and you'd suffocate it. Too little and it'd fade into a sulky glow. They used ash like a blanket, burying coals during the day to protect them from wind and moisture, then reviving them with dry grass and breath. There's a reason blowing on embers still means reviving something that almost died. That was literal job description. And when it worked, it wasn't quiet joy, it was triumph. The whole group could keep pretending they controlled nature when really, they'd just bribed it for another day. Losing the fire, though, that was social suicide. Ethnographic parallels from hunter-gatherer societies show how failure to guard the flame could earn you a reputation worse than theft. In some Australian Aboriginal communities, firekeepers were honoured figures. In others, they were just the person everyone blamed when things got cold. The moral was universal: let the fire die, and you might as well pack your mammoth fur and start walking until you find someone more responsible. The nightly ritual of tending embers also changed human rhythm. It created shifts, literal and social ones. Some stayed up, some slept, and dawn meant passing the glow from the tired to the rested, like a baton in the first human relay race. Those tiny transitions, watching, feeding, handing over, became the early choreography of cooperation. Civilization didn't start with agriculture. It started with one person whispering, "It's your turn," while handing another a burning stick. And it wasn't just duty, it was faith. People spoke to fire, fed it offerings, and treated its hiss like conversation. Later, myths, Greek, Hindu, Inuit. Inuit remember fire as alive because it always was. It breathed, it ate, it sulked. It demanded attention. Archaeologists can still see its moods in soot patterns and char depth, each layer a temper tantrum of oxygen and human anxiety. Over time, this vigilance turned into culture. Hearths became fixed, central, sometimes even sacred. No one left the camp without ensuring the flame was tucked safely under ash, like a sleeping god that must not be startled. When early humans moved, they carried embers with them, hidden in bark or dung, glowing like tiny hearts. Fire was no longer just warmth, it was continuity, a living thread connecting one place to the next, one generation of watchers to another. And as people began to settle, that small nervous act of guarding fire grew into something even stranger: ownership. Because once the flame could be kept alive, it could also be shared or denied. In the early days, fire didn't belong to anyone because nobody was foolish enough to think they could own it. It was too moody, too alive, too capable of turning your home into a smoking moral lesson. Fire was shared, like water or gossip. In most hunter-gatherer groups, the hearth wasn't private. It was public infrastructure with better lighting. Everyone depended on the same flame, and that dependency created the first social contract, one that didn't need writing, only warmth. Anthropologists studying groups like the San in southern Africa or the Hadza in Tanzania note that fire sits literally and symbolically at the center of camp life. The circle of stones around it wasn't just for safety, it was a map of belonging. To sit close was privilege. To share fire was intimacy. You could trade a spark the way modern people trade Wi-Fi passwords casually, but with unspoken trust. A stranger who brought their own fire was suspicious. One who asked for yours was human. It was around these flames that alliances were born and maintained. Among the Inuit, when two families met on the tundra, they would exchange embers to affirm peace. Aboriginal groups in Australia used fire-sharing rituals to mark friendship between clans. A guest who left with a burning brand carried both literal and social warmth home. Refusing to share, on the other hand, was almost violent, a declaration that you'd rather let someone freeze than let your embers dim. This communal flame also became the pulse of communication. Around it, people told stories, debated plans, and repaired the day's damage. Even in temporary camps, hearths were laid out so that the smoke rose together, merging above the group a small architectural poem about collective survival. Archaeologists can still trace it in Upper Paleolithic sites. The positioning of hearths reveals invisible communities, circles of conversation fossilized in ash. But communal didn't mean careless. There were rules, usually unspoken, but followed as faithfully as any scripture. Children learned early not to play with the fire, not because of danger, but because the flame wasn't theirs to toy with. The hearth was everyone's, and therefore sacred. It was the quiet authority in the center of the group, commanding respect without a word. Fire's communal nature also gave birth to one of humanity's earliest economic systems: shared labor. Someone gathered wood, someone blew on embers, someone cooked, and someone inevitably complained about the smoke. The division of tasks around the flame foreshadowed everything from kitchen hierarchies to corporate teamwork, just with more mammoth fat and fewer memos. Even the act of lighting a new fire carried social weight. It was rarely done alone. Ethnographic parallels show people kneeling together, bowing heads, tall friction sticks or stone tools, murmuring as if coaxing a child. The spark, when it finally caught, was met with collective relief as though the world had momentarily been in darkness and everyone had helped pull it back into existence. In that sense, every shared fire was a miniature civilization, boundaries defined by light, laws enforced by necessity, and equality measured by proximity to heat. The hearth wasn't property, it was society, burning quietly in the middle of everything that mattered. But this sense of community had another layer, one less symbolic and more literal. Because in most camps, there was someone who didn't just share the fire, someone who guarded it, body and soul. And more often than not, that someone was a woman. When archaeologists dig through Paleolithic ash pits, they find a peculiar kind of fingerprint, not carved into stone, but pressed into routine. The tending of fire, the slow, rhythmic feeding of heat and smoke, belonged most often to women. It wasn't ceremonial back then, it was survival disguised as domesticity. If men hunted in bursts of chaos, women mastered the long patience of maintenance. Fire demanded that kind of temperament, attention without drama, control without ego. Across foraging societies, from the Ache in Paraguay to the Hadza in Tanzania, it's women who sit closest to the flame. Ethnographies note it again and again. The steady motion of adding twigs, the cautious stirring of coals. The small gestures that kept the group alive while everyone else pretended to be heroic elsewhere. In Arctic camps, Inuit women fed seal oil into lamps that doubled as heaters, cooktops, and night lights. In Australian desert groups, women carried embers wrapped in bark and animal skin, cradling them as tenderly as infants during migrations. The hearth wasn't just their workplace, it was their pulse. The association between women and fire isn't accidental. Both were symbols of continuity, of warmth that outlasted the night. The oldest Indo-European root of the word hearth is related to kur, meaning to grow or to nourish. The same root, incidentally, gives us heart. It's not poetic coincidence. Ancient homes were designed with fire at their literal center, tended by the same hands that raised children, cured hides, and kept small economies running before the concept of economy existed. There's a kind of cruel irony in how modern history later rebranded this ancient skill as something trivial. The image of the housewife by the fire was once an emblem of sacred power. The hearth was a throne before it became a stereotype. Fire was both protector and prisoner, contained, soothed, and commanded by those who knew how not to anger it. Because make no mistake, fire could turn on you faster than a tired husband. One moment you're roasting roots, the next your shelter's a glowing cautionary tale. Women learned to read its moods. A hiss meant damp wood, a pop meant trapped resin, and a sudden flare meant stop daydreaming before your eyebrows joined the meal. In early settlements, tending fire also meant managing resources. Charcoal production, fuel gathering, and cooking efficiency were environmental mathematics done without parchment. A skilled firekeeper could make one log last an entire night, a feat of quiet engineering that saved the group from freezing. Some anthropologists even argue that women's expertise in managing controlled combustion directly influenced humanity's first experiments in pottery and metallurgy. After all, who else spent their lives staring into the behavior of heat until it made sense? Fire, in their hands, became more than tool, it became rhythm. The repetition of feeding it, shaping smoke, and whispering through long nights formed a kind of ritual memory that passed down through generations. It's not by chance that later goddesses of the hearth, Hestia, Vesta, Brigid, were all female. The mythology followed the labor. Somewhere between the Paleolithic and the Bronze Age, the woman crouched by the fire turned into a deity. And as the hearth took on meaning beyond cooking or warmth, it also became architecture, the gravitational center around which early life spun. If walls made a house, it was the hearth that made it human. Every ancient dwelling, from caves to clay huts, was designed around one burning point. Not for decoration, there was no ancient equivalent of open-plan living, but because everything people did, from tool-making to gossip, needed light, warmth, and a safe excuse to stop pretending the world outside wasn't trying to kill them. Archaeologists can read that centrality in the dirt itself. In sites like Dolní Vlastenice in the Czech Republic, circles of hearths mark where families gathered, and even their distribution tells a story, smaller ones for private meals, larger ones for communal rituals. The smoke stains on ceilings in places like Lazaret Cave or Terra Amata aren't random. They're the fingerprints of habit, of people sitting in the same spots for generations. faces flickering orange in the same rhythm. The hearth wasn't furniture, was choreography. People faced it, they still do. The fire's light extended the day, which is to say, it invented the evening, the one part of time that didn't belong to survival. After the hunts, the foraging, the gathering of things that could kill or feed you, came the slow exhale of nightfall. That's when people became something new, storytellers. It's not a coincidence that every culture associates the act of speaking truth, or at least entertaining lies, with the glow of a flame. The first myths were probably told not to pass time, but to explain why the fire danced the way it did. The hearth was also the first therapist's couch. People shared problems there because, unlike your neighbor, fire doesn't interrupt. The heat drew everyone closer, physically and psychologically, forcing proximity and, occasionally, honesty. Arguments happened in the dark corners. Reconciliation happened near the center. Children were lulled by the rhythm of crackling logs long before lullabies were composed. Fire's hum was humanity's first soundtrack, equal parts comfort and warning. Stay close, but not too close. And the warmth wasn't just emotional. Studies of ancient hearths show deliberate placement to control airflow, primitive interior design, balancing heat and smoke with surprising sophistication. Someone figured out that if you built a vent just so, the room filled with heat, but not death. Domesticity, it turns out, was an engineering project. Even early art owes its existence to this circle of heat and light. The flicker of the hearth was the original cinema. Paleolithic people used firelight to animate the walls of caves, making painted animals seem to move. It wasn't entertainment, it was transcendence via combustion. Fire let humans imitate the sun indoors, which was basically divine fraud, and they got away with it. What's remarkable is how stubbornly this pattern clings to us. Thousands of years later, people still design living rooms around glowing boxes that imitate the same hypnotic light. We've replaced wood with pixels, but the instinct's identical. Face the warmth, share the silence, pretend you're safe for a while. And yet, in those older days, when safety wasn't guaranteed and homes were temporary, fire couldn't simply stay at the center. It had to move with you. People learned to carry it, guard it, and rebuild it in every new place, like a transplanted heart still beating. For all its glory, fire was a terrible traveler. It refused to start icily, refused to stay alive without supervision, and died dramatically if exposed to rain. Yet humans were nomads, always on the move, so they learned a strange skill: how to carry a piece of lightning across the world without letting it go out. Imagine that, walking through wind, mud, and prehistoric pessimism, with your only heat source tucked into something that looked like a small, smoking miracle. Archaeological traces and ethnographic records tell us how they did it. People packed glowing embers into dried dung, wrapped them in bark or moss, or sealed them inside hollow animal horns. The material didn't just protect the ember, it fed it, allowing the slowest burn possible, a heartbeat of heat that could last for hours, sometimes days. Hunter-gatherers across Africa and Asia still practice variations of this, keeping a smoldering bundle in a pouch while moving camp, blowing on it occasionally like it's a reluctant pet. Among the Aboriginal Australians, women often carried fire sticks, half-burnt branches, glowing on one end. As they walked between camps, it was both tool and torch, protection and symbol. In some desert groups, if a person dropped their fire or let it die, they'd borrow a spark from another family, and act that wasn't just practical but social, renewing bonds in the same way medieval Europe later shared salt or bread. The exchange of fire was literally the exchange of life. Early nomads likely carried multiple embers, like backup souls. They understood redundancy long before engineers did. The fire carriers, often women or elders, would pause every few hours, crouch, and check the bundle, blow softly, adjust the wrapping, add a sliver of dry grass, keep the red core breathing. To lose it was not an accident, it was a betrayal. Some groups even had small rituals for reigniting fire after a journey, treating the moment like a resurrection. You didn't just say, "It's lit," you said, "It's alive again." Transporting fire also meant transporting meaning. In ancient myth, bringing fire from one place to another was an act of divine theft. Prometheus wasn't punished for inventing fire, he was punished for sharing it. The gods have always hated redistribution, but in real life, those who carried the flame weren't rebels, they were archivists. Each ember connected the new camp to the old, turning migration into continuity rather than rupture. The fire you warmed your hands by tonight might have been kindled from a coal kept alive for generations. Carrying fire taught humans precision. They learned to predict weather, identify dry materials, calculate how long a coal could last. It was the first lesson in thermal logistics, centuries before anyone invented the word thermodynamics. And while men bragged about hunting mammoths, it was the quiet discipline of transporting fire that actually kept the species alive long enough to tell stories about it later. Fire became the thread between places, the portable center of community. It allowed camps to be reborn overnight, civilizations to migrate, and myths to remember where they'd been. But eventually, humans grew tired of dependence on accidents and embers. If they could carry fire, maybe they could make it. And that's when things started to split literally. The first humans who learned to make fire must have felt like magicians who accidentally reinvented hell. Until then, the species had spent a few 100,000 years relying on whatever nature decided to set on fire for them. But somewhere in the late Lower Paleolithic, people realized they didn't have to wait for lightning or volcanoes. They could start the apocalypse themselves with sticks. Archaeological sites from Europe, Africa, and Asia show the slow birth of this audacious skill. Friction, fire. The principle was elegant, the execution miserable. You take two pieces of wood, rub them together fast enough, and hope your forearms outlast your self-esteem. The hand drill came first. A spindle twirled between blistered palms until a fine dust of wood reached ignition temperature. Later, clever minds invented the bow drill, a contraption that turned the problem of friction into the first prehistoric exercise machine. It worked, eventually, if you didn't die of boredom or shoulder pain. And yet, the payoff was miraculous. A tiny wisp of smoke, a curl of blackened dust, a spark turning to ember every fire made this way, was a creation story in miniature. Across continents, different materials became local solutions. Willow and poplar in Europe, cedar and sage in the Americas, bamboo in Asia. In colder regions, people found an even flashier trick, striking flint against pyrite or steel, creating sparks that looked like captured stars. By the time metallurgy appeared, firemaking had gone from miracle to morning routine. But the process wasn't just technical, it was spiritual performance. Many societies treated the act as taboo, reserved for specialists. In Polynesia, the Tahuahi firemaker was trained to coax flame with chants. Among early Indo-Europeans, new fire was made ritually at festivals, not casually between errands. Even in the ethnographic present, groups from Africa to the Arctic observe that fire shouldn't be made in anger because it remembers the mood of its birth. That sentiment might sound poetic, but there's a logic to it. Fire created through patience burned cleaner, steadier. Hastiness ruined the dust, wasted energy. It was as if the element refused to reward frustration. The ancients probably didn't know the physics, but they knew the personality. Fire, after all, isn't obedient, it's persuasive. You don't force it, you court it. The invention of firemaking fundamentally changed the species' relationship with risk. Before, humans were merely borrowers of flame. After, they became its manufacturers, and therefore its abusers. With controlled ignition came new possibilities. Pottery, metallurgy, land clearing, warfare. Fire stopped being a guest and became an employee, one that never unionized but frequently burned the office down in protest. Still, for all its danger, the ability to summon fire on demand made life bearable in the cold, in the dark, in the wild. It gave confidence where once there was dependency. For the first time, humanity carried not just fire, but power. And power, as always, needed an enemy. Because fire wasn't only used for warmth or cooking, it was also the oldest security system in the world. Before walls, doors, or the comforting illusion of civilization, there was fire, the only thing standing between humanity and everything that wanted to eat it. Night in the Pleistocene wasn't poetic darkness. It was an active food chain with no sense of boundaries. The world didn't go to sleep when the sun did, it went hunting. And yet, there sat a group of humans, unarmored, under-evolved, and audaciously squishy, daring the wilderness to come closer, because they had discovered the original keep-out sign, flame. Archaeological evidence from sites like Shaokudian in China and Gesher, Banat Yaakov in Israel suggests that hominins deliberately arranged fires in circles, a kind of prehistoric perimeter defense. The embers didn't just cook food, they redefined the geography of fear. Animals that once prowled freely learned to hesitate. Predators' eyes flashed in the distance, reflecting the glow they no longer dared to cross. Fire, for all its fragility, gave humans the illusion of dominion long before they earned it. And that illusion mattered. Firelight didn't just scare off lions, it scared off loneliness. It allowed people to sleep in shifts, to relax their grip on their spears, to dream without dying. Some anthropologists argue that this new sense of nocturnal safety fundamentally rewired the human brain, stretching social time, deepening bonds, encouraging language. It's easier to talk when you're not constantly being eaten. The protective circle of fire was also psychological armor. Once light divided the night into inside and outside, humanity could finally invent paranoia in peace. The fire's edge became a threshold. Beyond it, chaos. Within it, story. Every flicker outside the glow became a myth in progress. Monsters, spirits, ancestors. Fire didn't banish fear, it organized it. It gave shape to what hid in the dark, a boundary line for terror to respect. And as the species grew bolder, the same flame that repelled predators began to hunt them. Controlled burning drove herds into traps. Smoke flushed bees from hives. Torches turned caves from dens into tombs. Fire transformed humans from prey into participants in the predatory hierarchy of promotion that came with both pride and body odor. Still, fire's role as protector never faded. Even millennia later, nomadic groups in Africa and Central Asia kept night fires burning near camps, not just for warmth but as symbolic sentinels. Among the San, the glow itself was thought to keep spirits at bay. Among the Inuit, the seal oil lamp's steady light marked the border between the living and the nothingness outside. It was a promise: we're still here, but safety, once achieved, is never enough. The same fire that protected the tribe soon started demanding reverence. It wasn't merely useful anymore, it was holy, temperamental, and dangerously vain. People began to treat it less like a tool and more like a deity with boundary issues. Because once fire kept the beasts out, someone had to figure out how to keep the gods in. At some point, the nightly maintenance of warmth turned into theology. Fire stopped being just fire and started demanding adjectives: sacred, eternal, divine. It's almost as if humanity looked at this flickering, self-consuming miracle and thought, yes, let's build an entire bureaucracy around it. From the moment the first flame refused to die overnight, people began assuming it must have opinions. Across early civilizations, the evidence is everywhere. In the Indus Valley, charred altars hint at ritual offerings as far back as 2500 BCE. In ancient Iran, Zoroastrians built Atash-Baram's fire temples, where priests fed flames with aromatic woods while reciting prayers to Atara, the holy embodiment of truth. In Vedic India, Agni became the cosmic messenger who carried human offerings to the gods, a kind of divine postal service made of smoke. The Greeks gave the hearth to Hestia, the Romans to Vesta, and both staffed entire priesthoods whose main job description was, "Don't let it go out, no pressure." Eternal fires burned everywhere, from temples to city centers. They weren't symbols of comfort anymore, but of legitimacy. A city whose sacred flame died risked cosmic embarrassment. In Rome, the 6 Vestal virgins guarded the fire in the Forum, sworn to chastity because apparently the only way to ensure focus on firewood was celibacy. Their flame represented the endurance of the state, an impressive metaphor, though one suspects they occasionally wished for better ventilation. The link between fire and purity was irresistible. Fire didn't just cook food, it cleansed sins, sealed oaths, revealed truth. Trial by fire wasn't poetic, it was policy. You could literally burn your way to innocence, though the success rate was, shall we say, uneven. Meanwhile, in Persia and India, fire became too sacred to pollute with corpses or cooking. Temples kept it pure, away from anything remotely human. It was the divine introvert, adored from afar, never touched. What's remarkable is how the same idea appeared everywhere, independently. In Japan, the Shinto tradition of Himetsuri still celebrates fire as renewal. In the Andes, the Inca emperor lit sacred flames during solstice festivals using sunlight and gold mirrors, because, if you're going to start a fire, might as well make it stylish. Even nomadic peoples kept ceremonial flames, passing them along as relics of continuity. Fire became ancestry in physical form, always consuming itself. always reborn. Archaeologists find evidence of these sacred flames carefully maintained for centuries, ashes carried from old temples to new, as if the gods had moving day. The same spark that once boiled mammoth stew was now guarded in sanctuaries, fed on imported wood, and worshipped by professionals who probably hadn't chopped kindling in generations. Humanity had turned necessity into spectacle. But fire didn't just belong to priests, it started to belong to politics. Whoever claimed the right to light or extinguish the sacred flame claimed the right to rule. Divine kingship, national unity, cosmic order, all of it came down to who controlled the matches. And once fire became a matter of authority, someone had to enforce who got to touch it. The moment fire became sacred, someone decided it needed management. What started as a communal glow turned into a franchise complete with administrators, purity inspectors, and a dress code. Fire, the great equalizer of the Ice Age, was now behind a paywall. You could still cook your dinner, sure, but the real flame, the one that mattered to gods and kings, belonged to a select few with good posture and ceremonial hats. Priestly control over fire was one of humanity's first bureaucracies. In ancient Mesopotamia, temple complexes had entire staff rosters dedicated to maintaining ritual flames. Egyptian priests, armed with red torches and endless self-importance, performed dawn ceremonies to wake the sun god Ra with fire each morning, as if the cosmos would oversleep without supervision. In Persia, only a high-ranking magi could tend the sacred fire, and they did so with tongs of gold. Nothing says spiritual purity like managing combustion in full jewelry. The act of firekeeping, once shared by everyone, became a mark of privilege. Access to the temple flame meant access to the divine hotline. In many Indo-European cultures, noble families claimed descent from the first firebringers, using myth as genealogy and ash as PR. The hearth in a king's hall symbolized his cosmic authority, his ability to warm, feed, and destroy. You didn't just visit a monarch, you entered his flame. Even at the domestic level, hierarchy burned bright. In ancient Greece, every household maintained a hearth in honor of Hestia. But when a colony was founded, settlers carried a coal from the mother city's fire. It wasn't just symbolic, it was dependency, disguised as devotion. The colonists could light new fires, but they could never claim independence from the old one. Empire, in other words, was franchised heat. Among nomadic peoples, hierarchy played out more subtly. The central fire in a camp might belong to an elder or shaman, and others lit their torches from it in strict order. Sharing flame became a protocol. Who approached first, who waited, who was allowed to rekindle their hearth after a quarrel. Fire wasn't just warmth anymore, it was etiquette, an early version of bureaucracy in smoke form. Control of fire also created the concept of taboo. Some were forbidden to light it on certain days, others couldn't let it go out. In Polynesian societies, high chiefs had their own sacred fires that commoners couldn't look at, let alone borrow. In Rome, if the Vestal Virgins let their eternal flame die, it was considered both a religious crisis and an omen for state collapse. The punishment, being buried alive. Overreaction, yes, but nothing motivates quality assurance like premature interment. Fire became an index of power. Who tended it, who touched it, who was allowed to extinguish it all reflected one's place in the cosmic pecking order. The irony, of course, is that the element itself remained anarchic. It consumed rich and poor wood alike. Yet humans, in their eternal need for structure, turned it into a mirror of society. And the more they organized fire, the more they depended on it, especially those who had to carry it across impossible landscapes, where hierarchy meant nothing and survival meant ingenuity. Once people started moving with intention instead of accident, fire had to learn to travel smart. Nomads, herders, and migrants discovered that the world wasn't equally hospitable. Everywhere some landscapes laughed at sparks. So fire became not just sacred, but strategic. The same species that couldn't keep embers alive during a drizzle somehow figured out how to haul flame across deserts, tundra, and steppe without losing it to wind or boredom. In the Arctic, where trees were rarer than optimism, the Inuit and Chukchi learned to burn seal oil in stone lamps called kolik. The flame was delicate but dependable, a glowing bead of warmth that cooked food, melted snow, and lit the only hours of human conversation during months of darkness. Far from being symbolic, it was survival disguised as domestic art. The lamp had to be trimmed constantly with a bone tool, its wick nudged toward perfection like a nervous pet. When it went out, people didn't just relight it, they performed quiet apologies. In Central Asia, nomadic herders developed the opposite skill. Portable fires built on scarcity. With few trees and too many animals, dung became the default fuel. Burning it was efficient, smokeless, and just fragrant enough to discourage unwanted guests. The herders' fires were small, controlled, and often built inside felt tents, where every spark could become tragedy. Fire there was intimacy measured in degrees of caution. Across Africa's Sahel and savannas, the seasonal rhythm of rain and drought dictated when and how fires burned. Dry season bushfires were controlled tools, not disasters. They renewed grazing land, cleared pests, and told neighboring groups, "We're still here." In fact, early anthropologists coined the term firestick farming after observing Aboriginal Australians doing the same thing, walking the land, burning it deliberately to keep it alive. In these regions, lighting a fire wasn't destruction, it was conversation with the ecosystem. In steppe and desert communities, the placement of the hearth inside a tent or yurt was mathematical. The flame had to warm without suffocating, cook without scorching. Central Asian yurts still follow that logic. The smoke hole doubles as a compass, marking where the sun rises, sets, and where the spirits are expected to enter or leave. The hearth isn't, decor, its navigation, theology, and meteorology all glowing in one spot. Nomadic groups also learned to build fires suited to stealth. The Hadza in Tanzania use hunters' fires, low, nearly invisible flames built between stones to avoid detection. The Mongols perfected quick-start fires using flint and dried dung. The Sami of northern Europe carried kindling wrapped in birch bark, ready to light even in snowstorms. These were not recreational flames, they were logistical ones. The first field manuals on combustion strategy were written in footsteps, not words. And through all these innovations, one rule remained universal. Fire had to fit the season. In winter, it was the heart of the camp. In summer, it became a ghost, reduced, buried, sometimes even symbolically put to sleep. Keeping or killing it was never a casual choice. Each decision reflected the landscape's patience or vengeance. But even the most careful nomads learned that controlling fire wasn't just about keeping warm or cooking. It was about controlling the land itself. Because soon, people realized they could burn not to survive, but to shape the world. At some point, someone must have looked at a forest and thought, what if we just set it on fire politely? And so began humanity's longest-running environmental experiment, using flame to sculpt the landscape. What we now call controlled burning was once just instinctive genius burn. Now, eat later. It wasn't about destruction. It was about timing, rhythm, and the kind of ecological intuition that modern people now hire consultants for. The earliest evidence of this dates back tens of thousands of years. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples practiced what anthropologists dubbed firestick farming. They'd light small, patchy burns to clear underbrush, flush out game, and encourage new growth. It wasn't chaos, it was choreography. The fires moved in cycles, never large enough to scorch the soil, always leaving escape routes for animals. When early European colonists arrived, they called the land park-like, never realizing it looked that way because it was meticulously managed by fire for millennia. Similar strategies appeared independently across the world. North American tribes like the Karak Miwok and Yurok used fire to promote berry growth and open meadows for deer. In Africa, savanna peoples burned grasslands to renew grazing for cattle and to control ticks long before the words ecological balance appeared in any vocabulary. In both cases, fire was less a tool than a conversation, humans asking the land to respond and the land answering in green. Archaeologists studying charcoal deposits in peat layers can literally see these cycles. Every few decades, a thin black line of ash marks the controlled rebirth of a landscape. The irony is delicious. Modern ecologists now study indigenous fire regimes with high-tech drones, only to confirm that prehistoric people already solved wildfire prevention before anyone had invented bureaucracy. But fire was more than ecosystem management, it was calendar and clock. The time to burn was the time to move, to harvest, to hunt. Controlled burning created predictable abundance, and with abundance came settlement. In that sense, agriculture didn't replace fear, it formalized it. The first farmers were just pyromaniacs with better irrigation. Of course, control was an illusion. Sometimes the wind shifted, and what was meant to renew instead devoured. Ancient myths preserved the guilt. Greek tales of Phaethon, the reckless charioteer who scorched the world. Aboriginal stories of fire spirits punished for overburning. Hindu hymns pleading with Agni to burn kindly. These weren't random fables, they were environmental policy disguised as moral philosophy. Through millennia of experimentation, humans learned what every ecologist now preaches. Fire isn't the enemy, neglect is. Let brush build up, and the next spark becomes catastrophe. Keep fire close, feed it small doses, and it becomes a gardener. The oldest landscapes on Earth were curated by flame, and many still are. The African savanna, the Australian bush, the North American prairie, they exist, not despite fire, but because of it. But beneath this mastery was a quieter meaning. Fire wasn't just a tool for shaping the land, it was a line dividing worlds. The hearth, the blaze, the boundary all drew the same ancient truth. Fire marked where humanity ended and wilderness began. Fire, more than any wall or weapon, taught humanity the concept of inside and outside. Before it, there was only the indifferent openness of nature, a seamless world of wind, predators, and inconvenience. But the moment a flame flickered against darkness, a border appeared. On one side, warmth, safety, the illusion of control. On the other, everything else, cold, chaos, teeth. Fire didn't just illuminate, it divided. Archaeologists studying Paleolithic campsites notice how hearths were almost always placed near entrances, never in the center, never hidden away. They weren't just for cooking, they were checkpoints between worlds. Anyone who's ever camped knows the feeling. Step outside the light and the night immediately becomes thicker, heavier, somehow personal. Ancient people felt that too, and they responded by treating the fire's edge as sacred ground. You didn't cross it casually. You didn't spit into it. And if you did, someone probably whispered your name like a future cautionary tale. The hearth's light created the first social geometry, the circle. To sit inside its glow was to belong. To hover at the edges was to be tolerated. To fall beyond it was to vanish physically, socially, mythically. In many foraging groups, even today, firelight defines the limits of conversation and community. Among the Ruhonzi of the Kalahari, the circle of fire is where stories are told. Beyond it, where spirits roam. Ethnographies call this the firelight zone, but really, it's the original social network, just with fewer arguments and better lighting. Fire's boundary also birthed morality. What happened within its light was governed by rules, sharing, speech, respect. What happened beyond it belonged to instinct and danger. Crossing the line from the hearth's glow into the darkness was like stepping from culture back into nature. It's no coincidence that so many myths imagine hells and heavens made of fire. The flame was never neutral, it was the frontier itself, flickering between punishment and protection. The idea persisted in architecture. Neolithic homes often placed the hearth near the threshold, a symbolic guardian. In ancient Rome, the Lararium, a household shrine, was located by the family hearth, where domestic gods stood watch. In Mongolia, even the portable yurts of nomads follow this invisible grammar. The fire sits at the center, and the doorway must always face south, toward the sun. To turn your back on the fire while leaving is impolite. To step over it is unthinkable. Fire demands acknowledgement when crossing worlds. There's something profoundly human in that choreography of light. The flame draws borders, but it also connects them. Travelers arriving at night were greeted not with handshakes, but with a brand from the hearth. The fragment of safety extended across the dark. That small act transformed outsiders into insiders. Fire's border wasn't just defensive, it was diplomatic. And yet, borders invite rituals. Every once in a while, people deliberately erased the line, extinguishing all flames, plunging their world into symbolic night, and then relighting them together in one synchronized act of rebirth. Because sometimes, to keep fire sacred, you had to let it die first. Every culture that ever tamed fire eventually decided to kill it ceremonially, of course. You can't let something burn forever without giving it a symbolic nap. Across continents, civilizations developed the same peculiar ritual instinct. Once a year, extinguish every flame, let darkness swallow the world, and then relight it together. It was humanity's earliest reboot, a collective reminder that survival was a team sport, and the gods had a flair for drama. In ancient Mesoamerica, the Aztecs held the Shumolpili, or new fire ceremony, every 52 years, when the calendar cycles aligned, an apocalypse seemed slightly overdue. All fires across the empire were snuffed out. Priests climbed a hill outside Tenochtitlan, watched the Pleiades reach their zenith, and waited in unnerving silence. Then, using friction and sacrifice because Aztecs never did anything halfway, they ignited a new flame in a victim's chest cavity. That fire was carried back to the city, relighting every hearth. Exaggerated, certainly. Effective, absolutely. The empire renewed itself by burning one heart so the rest could keep beating. Further north, among Celtic peoples, Beltane marked a gentler version of the same idea. All village fires were put out and rekindled from a single need fire kindled on a sacred hill. Cattle were driven between twin bonfires to purify them. Lovers leaped over flames for fertility, and everyone pretended this was perfectly safe. The symbolism was unmistakable. Community unity through shared ignition. Chaos cleansed by smoke. The Slavs did it during Kapala night. The Zoroastrians through the periodic rekindling of temple fires. Even in Japan, Shinto shrines still perform Nino Masai, where old sacred flames are renewed using sunlight and mirrors. Whether Bronze Age or modern, the message remains the same. Fire isn't merely light, it's continuity. You don't own it. You borrow it from the last time the world remembered to start over. These renewal fires also carried political weight. Rulers and priests used them to reset authority, burning away last year's omens, mistakes, or unpopular policies in the same blaze of absolution. When the new flame spread through streets and homes, it wasn't just smoke that people inhaled, it was ideology, purified and warm. The first state propaganda campaign came with kindling. Anthropologists like Mircea Eliade loved to point out that for early civilizations, the act of creating fire was synonymous with creating order. Lighting the world again was proof that the cosmic machinery still worked, that the gods hadn't quit, that humanity hadn't been unfriended by the universe. Every spark was a small exorcism against entropy. And yet, beneath the ritual choreography lay something heartbreakingly pragmatic. People needed a reminder that the flame, whether divine or domestic, didn't light itself. Each relighting was an oath renewed, a collective whisper of "don't let it go out this time." Because even after thousands of years of worship, fire still had one last role left to play in it, as god or servant, but as inheritance. The flame passed down, generation to generation, each one a little older, a little dimmer, yet still breathing. Every civilization, in the end, learns the same lesson. Fire outlives its keepers. It's the one heirloom no one can hoard, yet everyone receives. From the first spark stolen from a lightning strike to the eternal flames burning at memorials and temples, humanity's story has been one long act of passing the torch, sometimes gently, sometimes after accidentally setting the curtains on fire. In myth, that handover was dramatic. The Greeks said Prometheus defied Zeus and gifted mortals the divine flame, which was generous until the liver-eating punishment part. The Ambori tell of Mui tricking the fire goddess Mahuika into giving him her fingernails, each one a spark. The Haida ravens stole it from selfish spirits who kept light to themselves. Every culture seems to agree, fire didn't come willingly, it had to be earned, tricked, or stolen. Apparently, sharing warmth was never management's idea, but outside the myths, inheritance was quieter. A mother blowing on coals at dawn, reviving yesterday's fire. An elder teaching a child how to read smoke or build a windbreak. A traveler leaving camp only after handing the embers to the next keeper. Knowledge, not flame, was what passed down. The art of fire wasn't in lighting, it was in not losing it. In that sense, every hearth was a memory, every ash pile a family archive. When archaeologists uncover ancient hearths, they find more than burnt wood. They find continuity, the same gesture-cupping hands around warmth, leaning close to Coke's lifelinks, Pleistocene caves to modern kitchens. Even now we gather around artificial fires, candles, gas stoves, screens glowing in dark rooms. We still crave that ancient geometry of faces lit from below, stories spiraling upward like smoke. The materials changed. The instinct didn't. Fire also shaped legacy in ways less sentimental. It built civilizations and destroyed them with equal enthusiasm. It smelted metal, cleared forests, and powered every revolution, industrial or otherwise. Humanity's progress is a history of controlled combustion. Coal, oil, engines, rockets, each one a more sophisticated way of saying, "Look what we can burn now." The irony, of course, is that after a few million years of keeping the flame alive, we've finally managed to make it too alive. Climate, forests, oceans all now whisper the same warning the first firekeepers knew by heart. Don't let it get out of hand. Still, even as the planet smolders, the metaphor endures. Fire remains the stand-in for soul, spirit, will, the thing we claim keeps us human. When someone says keep the fire burning, they're unknowingly echoing the Paleolithic mother with her ember bundle, the Roman Vestal in her temple, the Zoroastrian priest feeding the eternal flame. Every generation adds its smoke to the same sky, and maybe that's the real inheritance, not the flame itself, but the vigilance it demands. Fire taught us patience, cooperation, reverence, and just enough arrogance to think we could control it. It turned night into time, hunger into art, and survival into story. It never stayed where we put it, but somehow, it always followed. Even now, in a world of electric light and mechanical suns, we still gather around it, literal or digital, seeking warmth, connection, and the reassurance that somewhere, someone's still awake, watching the embers, making sure the dark doesn't win tonight. Humanity's first interior design choice was desperation. Long before open-concept kitchens and decorative fireplaces, there was a single-room nightmare full of damp air, bone tools, and relatives who refused to stop breathing in your face. Archaeological evidence from Ice Age sites like Mazirik and Dolny Vastanis shows that home once meant a semi-buried pit, lined with mammoth bones and covered in hides, a claustrophobic bubble of warmth barely big enough to stretch without elbowing your grandmother. And right in the middle, a fire. Always the fire. The entire structure existed for it. Early shelters weren't designed for privacy or comfort, but for heat retention, which meant minimal space, minimal ventilation, and maximal shared breath. The walls leaned inward, as if conspiring to keep every degree of warmth trapped like gossip. In this prehistoric architecture, there were no corners for solitude, only bodies packed close, exhaling into each other's dreams. Anthropologists have even found overlapping sleep impressions in cave dust, faint hollows of shoulders, hips, and knees pressed together in rhythmic formation, like a human thermal battery trying not to freeze solid. The hearth sat at the exact point where oxygen and common sense ran out. It provided light, food, and just enough smoke to sting the eyes of everyone who wanted to complain. In those days, the smell of home wasn't lavender or lemon soap. It was carbon. Everything hair hides, lungs absorbed it. Even bones found in Upper Paleolithic burials show traces of long-term smoke inhalation. That's how intimate the relationship was. People carried their homes inside their skeletons. But there was beauty in that dysfunction. The hearth wasn't just the source of heat. It was the anchor around which the world organized itself. Children were born near it. Stories were told through its flicker. Tools were carved beside its light. If it died, the entire social organism fell apart. There were no hallways to escape into, no side rooms to sulk in, only one shared climate of smoke and survival. The family didn't gather around the fire because it was cozy. They did it because death by exposure was worse for morale. It's strange to imagine, but architecture began, not with ambition, but with lungs. The shape of shelters mirrored the shape of breath, small, enclosed, inhaling and exhaling heat, like a creature of its own. Anthropologists studying ancient floor plans can almost trace the rhythm of life, from the pattern of ash and soot, where cooking happened, where people sat, where the dogs curled. Every domestic space was a kind of human lung, breathing warmth in and smoke out, reminding everyone inside that existence was a group project. Still, the architecture of warmth had its price. The closer people huddled, the more they needed each other, and the harder it became to pretend otherwise. What began as a structural necessity soon evolved into a biological one. Closeness as insulation, intimacy as temperature control. Families didn't just live together. They survived by sharing air. And in the coldest corners of the world, that necessity became an art form, humans learning to use their own bodies as heating systems, pressed so near the hearth that even their breath joined the smoke. In the world before blankets, survival was measured in inches specifically. The inches between your skin and someone else's. The further apart you slept, the shorter your life expectancy. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence from Ice Age Europe to the Arctic Circle tells the same story. Humans didn't just cuddle for affection, they cuddled for atmospheric efficiency. In subarctic shelters, warmth wasn't generated, it was redistributed. The Inuit, Chukchi, and Sami all perfected this choreography of proximity. Entire families, grandparents, parents, infants, dogs, slept in tight formation, wrapped in layered hides, and breathing into each other's hair. Inside snow houses or reindeer hide tents, the air was thick, wet, and slightly smoky, a blend of carbon and kinship. Anthropologists who've studied these environments describe them as microclimates of intimacy, which is an elegant way of saying condensed humanity. Even prehistoric people understood the physics. The human body radiates about 100 watts of heat, and in an ice age night, that meant the difference between comfort and corpse. Shared breathing kept air circulating just enough to prevent suffocation, while shared contact stopped heat loss. It was an elegant biological system built on mutual inconvenience. A child might wake to find their grandmother's hand across their face, a dog's tail in their mouth, and still be grateful, because they were warm. What's remarkable is how this necessity shaped culture. Proximity became normal. Personal space didn't exist because space itself didn't. Families lived, slept, and dreamt in the same radius of warmth. Even the dead often remained close. Burials beneath living floors are found in sites like Dolny, Vistanis, where ancestors quite literally insulated their descendants. Death was less an ending than a contribution to heating. It's no coincidence that languages born in these climates are rich in collective terms for kin and home. The Sami word goti refers not just to a tent, but to the people and warmth inside it. The Ewenki word arosa means both shelter and family. The two concepts were interchangeable. You couldn't separate warmth from belonging any more than you could separate breath from smoke. Of course, this intimacy had its downsides. The same enclosed spaces that preserved heat also preserved disease. Shared breath meant shared microbes, and tuberculosis loved the Ice Age like an exclusive club. But even then, people chose closeness over cleanliness. The cold punished independence. Sleeping alone wasn't brave, it was suicidal. To modern sensibilities, this kind of communal sleeping might sound primitive or oppressive, but to those who practiced it, it was survival disguised as tenderness. They didn't need words like bonding or attachment theory. They had the practical version. Stay close or die. It's an evolutionary love language written in breath. And over time, this habit of closeness did something strange to the human psyche. It made the hearth not just a heater, but a gravitational force, the point around which social life, ritual, and affection orbited. In those cramped, smoky dwellings, warmth wasn't just a condition, it was a relationship. And that relationship had a visible, flickering heart, a small circle of fire that defined who belonged and who didn't. Every household on Earth, before walls learned to multiply, revolved around a single fire. It wasn't just the source of warmth, it was the gravitational core of family life. The hearth decided where people slept, where they sat, how they spoke, even how they thought. Archaeologists studying Upper Paleolithic campsites can tell who lived together by the ash distribution on the floor, a strange kind of prehistoric census written in soot. Whoever sat closest got the heat and the responsibility. Whoever sat furthest got the smoke and the draft. That was family hierarchy, scientifically enforced by physics. The hearth was the original family portrait. You can still see it in cave reconstructions, concentric circles of activity radiating out from the fire's glow. The innermost zone, children, mothers, and the nightly chaos of feeding, nursing, and keeping embers alive. The middle ring, toolmakers, storytellers, and those pretending to be helpful. The outer zone, men sharpening things dramatically, pretending to be useful but mostly absorbing heat through pride. Fire structured time, too. It dictated waking, working, eating, and sleeping. Morning meant stirring embers back to life. Evening meant watching them dim like a slow calendar. When the hearth went out, the day ended, there was no other clock. Anthropologists call it a central place economy, but really, it was just the economy of not freezing to death. Every action looped back to that glowing center. Meals cooked, hides cured, teeth mended, marriages arranged, gossip born. It also defined belonging. To sit by the family fire was to be part of the inner circle. Strangers were kept at the edges, sometimes physically, sometimes spiritually. In many cultures, from Siberian reindeer herders to ancient Greeks, Stepping across someone else's hearth without invitation was taboo, an invasion of both space and soul. Even today, hearth still means home in most Indo-European languages. It's linguistic muscle memory, a faint warmth left in our words. Smoke became a kind of invisible architecture, filling the small room and binding everyone inside. It seasoned their clothes, their lungs, their gods. Archaeologists have even found soot-coated figurines placed near hearths, early household deities blackened by devotion. Fire was the mediator between family and cosmos. It turned raw meat into food, darkness into safety, chaos into conversation. It was domestic alchemy, and everyone breathed the results. But this intimacy came with an unglamorous price. The air was thick, often unbreathable. In Neolithic homes, the ceiling above the hearth was black, the air acrid, the eyes raw. Yet families stayed. They ate, laughed, argued, and inhaled slowly dying wood together, because the alternative was silence and frost. Modern comfort is built on distance, ventilation, separation, privacy. Ancient comfort was the opposite. Being close enough to choke together meant you were still alive, and in that shared air, something else was forming. The first awareness that safety and sickness could come from the same breath. People didn't yet have words for pollution or health, but they could feel the difference between warmth that healed and warmth that hurt. The hearth kept you alive and slowly killed you, all at once, which, come to think of it, might be the most human invention of all. Still, nobody moved away. There was nowhere to go. The cost of comfort was inhaled quietly, night after night, until it left its trace in bone and ash. And those traces still whisper the same truth, that survival always came with smoke. If warmth was love in the Ice Age, it was also a slow kind of poison. Archaeologists studying prehistoric skeletons have noticed something grimly poetic: soot inside ribs, dark residue clinging to lung cavities, microscopic carbon dust etched into bone like smoke trapped in marble. Those weren't accidents. They were the anatomical side effects of family life. Before chimneys, before windows that opened, before anyone had the luxury of complaining about air quality, every household was its own small inferno. The hearth that kept you alive also turned your lungs into archives of devotion. Studies of Neolithic dwellings from Central Europe to East Asia show the same pattern: low ceilings, sealed roofs, and a single vent that barely worked. When fires were lit for hours each day, cooking, heating, lighting, drying, the air thickened into a permanent fog. Home wasn't cozy, it was carcinogenic. In places like Catalyuk, in Anatolia, one of the world's earliest cities, excavations revealed layer upon layer of soot coating interior walls. Residents slept, ate, and gave birth amid constant haze. Imagine generations of people waking with sore throats and watering eyes, yet calling it normal. And it was. For 10,000 years, home meant a cough you couldn't quite shake. The irony is that this deadly intimacy was deliberate. Opening a vent meant losing heat, and losing heat meant death. The choice was simple: suffocate slowly or freeze quickly. Most people opted for the long game, even when ancient builders began experimenting with primitive flues and smoke holes. They placed them carefully, allowing just enough ventilation to prevent blindness, but never enough to let the room actually clear. Survival demanded a specific kind of misery: constant, predictable, shared. Children grew up in that haze, their lungs still soft, their immune systems negotiating with the environment like tiny diplomats. The result was a population tough enough to endure centuries of poor air, but frail enough to die from the same flame that fed them. Anthropologists studying modern traditional houses in the Himalayas and Sahel regions note similar conditions: particulate concentrations higher than modern city smog, yet people sitting calmly, chatting beside it, eyes half closed in peaceful defiance. They've simply made peace with the burn. And the hearth didn't just mark the body, it marked the soul. Smoke became cultural shorthand for endurance. In countless myths, the rising plume carried prayers or souls to heaven, a poetic interpretation of what was basically carbon monoxide. What humans couldn't escape, they sanctified. Coughing was transformed into piety. The sting in the eyes became a metaphor for devotion. Still, the daily ritual of sharing air had its quiet logic. In those suffocating rooms, families bonded in discomfort, united by necessity and the occasional wheeze. The thick, Smoky air blurred distinctions between bodies. Everyone breathed the same warmth, inhaled the same ghosts. Togetherness meant contamination, but also communion. And within that clouded intimacy, patterns formed. Who slept where? Who woke first? Who tended the embers through the night? The choreography of survival took on structure and, inevitably, hierarchy. Because in every home, someone always slept closest to the fire, and someone always got the smoke. For all its illusion of unity, the family hearth was never democratic. Even in a single-room home, warmth had a hierarchy. Archaeological reconstructions of early dwellings show that sleeping spots weren't random. They were ranked by temperature and risk. Closest to the fire slept those who couldn't leave: children, the elderly, and women, not out of privilege, but practicality. Someone had to feed the flame through the night, and that someone was almost always female. In ancient households from Anatolia to Scandinavia, traces of daily life settle in concentric rings around the hearth: pottery shards, spindle whorls, bones from meals, all clustered in what archaeologists politely call the domestic zone. It's academic code for the space, where women kept everyone else alive. They cooked, dried clothes, smoked meat, boiled medicine, and maintained the fire like a temperamental deity. The men drifted in and out, orbiting the heat like celestial tourists, returning mostly to eat or lecture. Among traditional Arctic families, it was women who managed the seal oil lamps, scraping, trimming, refilling, and keeping them steady through endless nights. In Central Asian yurts, ethnographies still note a clear social geometry: the left side of the hearth, reserved for men and guests; the right, for women and daily life. And though the genders shared one flame, they didn't share it equally. The warmth radiated outward, but the labor that sustained it stayed fixed in place. The hearth was a job, not a comfort. Falling asleep beside it wasn't a luxury but an occupational hazard. Sparks jumped, logs rolled, embers spat, and someone had to wake before disaster. The price of vigilance was heat, and the wage was smoke. In that sense, women were the first night shift workers in human history, guarding the light while others dreamed. Yet this proximity also gave them power, the kind that goes unnoticed because it's constant. Whoever controlled the fire controlled the rhythm of the household. The ability to coax flame from coals, to sense its hunger before it faltered, was both skill and authority. In myth, the role persisted. Goddesses of the hearth, Hestia, Vesta, Brigid, are soft-spoken but absolute, embodying the quiet governance of those who can't afford mistakes. Even the space itself reflected that balance of duty and dignity. The area nearest the fire became a private domain in a world without walls, a place where mothers whispered, babies fed, and old women remembered. It was the original office, the original altar, and, occasionally, the original gossip circle. Every society that left evidence of a hearth also left evidence of its keeper. You can almost see her in the ash layers: bent posture, soot-lined fingers, the ghost of patience burned into clay floors. But there was another side to that glow. Beyond the domestic warmth, the fire cast long, flickering shadows across faces. It was here, in this uncertain light, that the family didn't just survive together, it became together. The fire wasn't just a tool or a task. It was an atmosphere that sculpted emotion, conversation, and memory. Because when the night settled and everything else went silent, the fire spoke, and people, at last, listened. Firelight changed the way humans looked at each other. Not metaphorically, literally. The flicker made faces move, turned eyes into molten glass, and softened every hard edge. Archaeologists can't excavate that glow, but they can infer it from what it did to behavior. Somewhere between the sparks and the shadows, humanity learned the art of being together without purpose. In every society that slept near the hearth, the evening wasn't a time slot, it was a mood. The day's noise dimmed, work slowed, and suddenly the entire household found itself staring into the same trembling orange center. Half hypnotized, half exhausted, conversation took on that half-whispered rhythm that only comes when everyone's too tired to lie. Even now, campfire studies, yes, people actually research this, show that flickering light lowers heart rate and encourages storytelling. Fire didn't just illuminate, it domesticated time. Under that dim choreography, relationships thickened. Parents told children stories of ancestors. Lovers sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing the same air and the same ash. The first oral traditions were born there, not from an urge to educate, but from the strange social gravity of shared glow. Words flowed easier when half your audience was mesmerized by flame. Myths, genealogies, jokes, all woven between bursts of smoke. And because the fire couldn't be ignored, it became a silent participant in everything. It hummed while people whispered, sighed when logs shifted, and occasionally exploded in small bursts of criticism. Its warmth pressed people together, while its shadows stretched their imaginations. There's a reason early humans painted on cave walls near hearths. The fire made still images move. Flicker and pigment collaborated long before cinema claimed the patent. But firelight intimacy wasn't all tenderness. The same flicker that made faces look kind could make them terrifying. A sudden shift in flame, and a friend's expression turned into something ancient, half animal, half omen. Night around the hearth was never fully safe. It was simply familiar danger, domesticated enough to make you forget it could still burn. And yet, even in that uncertainty, people found comfort in proximity. The human brain evolved to read emotion in the dance of faces. Firelight turned that decoding into nightly ritual. You learned to gauge your kin not by what they said, but by how the light trembled across their eyes. Love, suspicion, grief, all revealed in the shared performance of reflection. In the flickering hours before sleep, when conversation dwindled and only the hiss of sap and breath remained, people entered a collective trance. The smoke blurred outlines, softened divisions between bodies. Children drifted into dreams, while elders stared at the coals like they were reading an old book. It was here, in this glowing half-silence, that the family's emotional temperature matched the physical one. Warm, close, flickering, and always on the edge of fading. And the fire gave more than mood. Its smoke, that thick, aggravating, necessary byproduct, didn't just fill lungs. It filled the air with purpose. Because while light was beauty, smoke was utility. It seeped into everything: food, clothes, rituals, the air itself. It was the invisible architecture that made homes livable, and somehow survivable. If fire was the family's heart, smoke was its atmosphere, intrusive, persistent, and surprisingly useful. For all the coughing it caused, smoke held a strange kind of domestic intelligence. It preserved, purified, and protected, even while slowly embalming the people who breathed it. The home, after all, was not an ecosystem apart from nature, but a small negotiation within it. Smoke was the middleman in that deal. Inside huts and caves, it served as the first pesticide. Mosquitoes, flies, and fleas fled from the haze, leaving only the humans stubborn enough to stay. Ethnographies recording households in rural Africa, the Amazon, or Southeast Asia still find smoke deliberately trapped beneath roofs. A visible haze used to keep insects and spirits equally at bay. It's not superstition. It's chemistry. The same particulates that choke lungs also repel anything with better instincts. Then there was preservation. Before salt, before refrigeration, there was smoke, wrapping meat, fish, and hides in a slow-burning embrace that turned decay into dinner. Archaeological residues on early pottery and bones show distinct layers of soot, the signature of indoor smoking pits that doubled as kitchens and smokehouses. Entire homes were perfumed with that aroma of burnt fat and survival. When families slept in those spaces, their hair, skin, and blankets carried the scent, half perfume, half warning. The smoke did more subtle work, to dried hides and thatch, hardened wooden beams, and, paradoxically, slowed rot. It sterilized water bowls and repelled mold from grain stores. In that sense, the constant haze wasn't negligence, it was maintenance. Domestic architecture evolved around it. Small vents under roofs, angled beams to direct flow, deliberate leaks disguised as cracks. You could call it an early form of climate engineering, if climate engineering involved a daily headache. In tropical and temperate regions, the balance between ventilation and smoke retention became a kind of art. Too much air, and insects returned. Too little, and your children developed a chronic cough. The right amount created the ideal domestic fog, thick enough to sting, thin enough to see across the room. Anthropologists have found that in many traditional societies, children learn to read smoke as language. Color, movement, and smell all mean something. Pale wisps, good burn; black plume, damp wood, curling back into the room, storm coming. The fire didn't just cook food, it taught meteorology. And then, of course, there was symbolism. Rising smoke connected ground to sky, a vertical axis of existence. What couldn't be sent in words was sent in vapors, prayers, grief, gratitude, or the occasional goat. The line between practical and sacred blurred, as it always did. But this ecology of smoke also shaped behavior. It kept families low to the ground, crouched in postures of patience. It made air itself communal property. You couldn't breathe without sharing. Every inhale carried a trace of everyone else's exhale. That intimacy, that saturation, bred both resilience and claustrophobia. Still, no one complained much. You didn't argue with what kept you alive. And life inside that haze, for all its discomfort, created the most unbreakable rule of the ancient household. You never slept too far from the fire, and never too far from each other. Because closeness, in the end, wasn't just sentimental, it was strategic. It wasn't only smoke they shared in the dark, it was vigilance. Night, for most of human history, was not romantic. It was logistical. Once the fire dimmed and the world went black, every sound outside the circle of light meant possible death, claws, breath, or something worse, another human. Sleep wasn't rest, it was a rotation. People didn't sleep alone because the dark didn't negotiate with individuals. They slept in clusters, a tangle of bodies, instincts, and borrowed trust, each person both sentinel and blanket. Archaeological evidence from Ice Age camps shows circular sleeping patterns around the hearth, the same arrangement that can still be seen among the Hadza of Tanzania or the Nenets of Siberia. It wasn't design, it was defense. Everyone faced inward, toward warmth and visibility. The body itself became architecture. To step over sleeping relatives meant crossing a barrier of vigilance. Someone always stirred, someone always muttered, someone always heard. In a world without locks, this was the alarm system. The pattern was efficient, if suffocating. Children in the center, elders just beyond, adults at the perimeter. Dogs curled against the edges, their ears trained to the night. When wind or noise slipped through the entrance, it hit the outer sleepers first. Natural tripwires made of flesh and fatigue. The human brain, it turns out, never fully shuts down in groups. Modern sleep studies confirm it. One hemisphere stays slightly more alert when others are near. A neurological relic of the days when warmth and awareness were the same thing. Sleeping together was social choreography, a nightly affirmation of unity and paranoia. Families learned each other's breathing rhythms the way modern people memorize ringtone patterns. A shift in breath could wake the entire room. Someone coughing, someone sighing, the faint scratch of something outside, all blended into the pulse of survival. Privacy didn't exist, and neither did silence. But security wasn't just about predators, it was also about people. The same fire that drew families close also drew strangers, travelers, in-laws, exiles, and each new body meant both safety and danger. Hospitality was a calculated risk. To share your fire was to share your night watch. That's why so many cultures treated guests with both reverence and suspicion. Feed them, yes, but sleep with one eye open. The nightly group formation also reinforced status. Who slept closest to the entrance was a statement of trust and expendability. The head of the household might insist on proximity to the hearth, but the unspoken hierarchy decided who acted as insulation and who faced the cold. Even affection had a thermal dimension. Lovers lay near the warmth. Servants and cousins learned humility in the draught. Yet for all its tension, the communal sleep pattern worked. It kept the fire alive, the predators cautious, and the group intact. Even now, the instinct lingers. Families camping outdoors instinctively arrange themselves around a central light. Soldiers in trenches huddle in clusters. Infants sleep better near breathing adults. The ancient logic remains. Closeness prevents extinction. And as human dwellings grew larger, walls appeared, and doors replaced bodies as boundaries. The practice began to fade. Slowly, the hearth became symbolic, and the collective bed fragmented into rooms. Safety no longer required proximity, or so people believed. The day humans started sleeping apart was the day they invented privacy, and all the quiet loneliness that came with it. Somewhere between the flicker of a shared fire and the hiss of a closed stove, humanity decided it had had enough of each other's breathing. The transition from collective sleeping to solitary rooms didn't happen overnight. It crept in, like a draft through a new wall. Archaeologists and historians trace it to architecture, the slow evolution from one-room shelters to multi-room houses. But beneath the bricks, it was something psychological. The moment warmth no longer required company. The Neolithic longhouse, the Iron Age roundhouse, the medieval hall, all were built around a single hearth, smoky and communal. Then, as metallurgy improved and chimneys appeared, heat became portable. You no longer had to share it, you could buy it. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the invention of stoves, flues, and insulation quietly dismantled millennia of enforced intimacy. The hearth shrank from a center of gravity to a decorative feature. Families began to scatter within their own homes, each retreating into private climates of comfort. But the move toward separation wasn't just technological, it was moral. As European societies industrialized, sleeping together began to look suspicious, a sign of poverty, immorality, or both. Manuals of etiquette warned against crowded bedding, associating shared warmth with animality. The rich began walling off their bedrooms as symbols of refinement. The poor, meanwhile, were criminalized for doing what humans had always done, surviving by touch. Privacy became virtue, proximity, shame. In cities, urban housing reformers of the 19th century turned air itself into a moral issue. Ventilation, cleanliness, hygiene all became metaphors for purity. Smoke, once the scent of family, was recast as filth. Architects installed chimneys and windows, not just for air, but for distance. The home was no longer a body. It was a collection of organs, each separated by walls to prevent contamination, social, moral, or otherwise. Yet even as domestic space fractured, nostalgia lingered. The fireplace refused to die. It became symbolic, ornamental, the new altar of middle-class respectability. People no longer needed it for heat, but they gathered around it anyway, a subconscious reenactment of something older, a ritual performed out of evolutionary muscle memory. The phrase hearth and home survived long after its literal smoke had cleared. Anthropologists studying modern households sometimes note that, despite our obsession with privacy, we keep recreating the circle we supposedly escaped. Living rooms, televisions, campfires, even phone screens, all emit that same hypnotic glow. We've replaced wood with pixels, embers with electricity, but the geometry hasn't changed. The desire to be near a shared source of light remains buried somewhere between nostalgia and neurology. Still, the air feels different now, cleaner, quieter, lonelier. The old choreography of sleeping bodies and overlapping breaths has dissolved into bedrooms and corridors, each person inhabiting a private climate of warmth. We no longer smell of one another's smoke. We smell of fabric softener and isolation. But deep in our bones, in the layers of carbon that still echo from 1,000 shared fires, there's a trace of that old closeness, that smoky democracy of breath. The body remembers what the architecture forgot, and that memory, faint but stubborn, smolders still, in our words, our rituals, and in the last symbolic flame that refused extinction, the hearth of remembrance. The hearth never really went out. It just moved from clay floors to brick chimneys, from living rooms to language. Even when houses no longer needed it, people kept building symbolic ones, as if afraid that without a center, life might scatter completely. You can still feel its ghost in the way people talk about home, under one roof, keeping the fire alive, the heart of the house. They're all linguistic fossils, bits of ancient smoke still trapped in our breath. Across cultures, when the practical need for a shared fire faded, its spiritual residue only grew stronger. The Greeks made Hestia, goddess of the hearth, the first honored in every household ritual. Romans had Vesta, whose virgins tended an eternal flame that symbolized the survival of the state. In Japan, the kamado, the cooking hearth, evolved into the word for home itself. Even today, Zoroastrian temples keep sacred fires burning continuously, some for centuries. The modern fireplace is just a polished echo of these ancient obsessions. Same awe, less lung damage. The hearth endured because it was never just about heat. It was about gravity, emotional, social, cosmic. It marked the exact point where chaos became order, where wilderness turned domestic, where strangers turned family. The firelight didn't just reveal faces, it organized them. Around it, people found shape, routine, and belonging. And when the flame went out, it wasn't just cold, they feared, it was dissolution. Without fire, the family blurred back into the night. Even after separation and modernity, that instinct to gather around warmth survived in disguise. We built restaurants with open kitchens, cities with glowing plazas, and technologies that beam shared light into our private rooms. The screen became the new hearth, the place where families still assemble, silent, half entranced, faces flickering in pale imitation of firelight. The content changed, but the ritual didn't. Sit close, stare forward, pretend you're not alone. Archaeologists, when they excavate the blackened pits of ancient dwellings, often describe the hearth as the most human layer. They mean it literally. Ashes mixed with bone fragments, food traces, bits of pottery, the debris of routine. But it's also metaphoric. Every generation builds its own hearth out of what's left behind, the residue of togetherness, the smoke of old warmth. Even our nostalgia is carbon-based. Perhaps that's why, no matter how modern life becomes, we still light candles at funerals, torches at protests, lamps at vigils. Fire remains our shorthand for memory, connection, and endurance. The act of lighting it says, we're still here. The act of keeping it alive says, we still belong. The family that once slept close enough to share smoke may no longer exist, but its echo survives in every gesture that brings people back toward a common glow. Whether it's a campfire, a candle, or a pixelated flame on a cold screen, the message hasn't changed. We still crave the same thing our ancestors did, a circle of light in the dark, a little heat to share, and someone near enough to breathe the same air. And so, long after the last hearth turned cold, humanity still keeps vigil over the faint, stubborn memory of warmth that refuses to die out. Fire was humanity's first miracle and its first migraine. It promised warmth, light, safety, and dinner that didn't bite back, but it demanded attention, like a spoiled deity. Archaeological traces from places like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa show that early humans had learned to control fire nearly 1 million years ago. But control here means something closer to negotiation. There were no matches, no flints in the pocket, no lighter fluid. One moment, the flames danced like loyal companions. The next, a gust of wind or a bit of damp wood, and they were gone, snuffed out, as if by divine insult. That was the fragile contract of prehistory. Everything depended on one glowing patch of coals. Lose it, and your world went dark, cold, and very short-lived. The spark wasn't symbolic. It was literal life insurance. It dried the hides that kept you warm, boiled the water that didn't kill you, scared off the animals that wanted to. To early humans, fire wasn't an element, it was a relative with mood swings. In the caves of Gasha, Banat, Yaakov, Israel, layers of ash and burned flint tell the story of people who spent their lives feeding this volatile companion. The evidence suggests deliberate fire use, meaning someone had to keep the flames alive through rain, hunger, and boredom. Imagine that task, nights stretching endless, the world colder than forgiveness. Your only job to keep the glow breathing. If it went out, everyone woke up angry, freezing, and suddenly spiritual. Because once the fire died, the only option left was prayer, to lightning, to friction, or to luck. Even now, the mind recoils at the thought of living that close to disaster. A single spark, that's all it took. One ember drifting wrong could turn your shelter to ash, but no ember at all meant starvation. Fire demanded both obedience and defiance. Too much humility, and you froze. Too much arrogance, and you burned. It was, in that sense, humanity's first philosophy class, a crash course in moderation, conducted entirely in smoke. And the smoke never stopped reminding them who was in charge. The bones unearthed in these early campsites tell quiet stories of burns, singed hair, and inhaled soot. Controlling fire was less about mastery than endurance. It was a daily act of humility, an unending rehearsal of failure narrowly avoided. Anthropologists like to call this technological adaptation. Everyone else would have called it Tuesday. Still, the miracle persisted. Each flame that survived another night felt like proof that the world hadn't turned its back. And because fire could vanish as easily as it appeared, the humans who kept it alive began to change. They developed rituals, routines, even roles. Someone had to stay awake to feed the embers, to watch, to guard, because that small circle of heat was more than survival. It was civilization in miniature, glowing in the dark, daring not to die. And in that flickering half-light, responsibility was born, not the abstract moral kind, but the literal, sleepless, smoke-in-your-eyes variety. Long before there were priests, soldiers, or politicians, there was someone whose only job was not to let the fire go out. Anthropologists call them firekeepers, but that term sounds far too noble for what was. Essentially, the planet's first unpaid night shift. These were the people who sat up in the dark while everyone else slept, squinting at embers and muttering to sticks. Theirs was a profession born of paranoia, the knowledge that one lazy hour could mean freezing, starvation, or a very awkward explanation to the tribe in the morning. Archaeological traces of habitual fire maintenance stretch back hundreds of thousands of years. At sites like Beeches, Pit in England, or Terra Amata in France, scientists have found repeated fire spots, hearths rebuilt in the same place again and again. That's not accident. That's evidence of scheduling. Someone tended those flames deliberately, long enough for soot to stain rock and for ash to stratify like geological anxiety. You can almost picture it, one figure poking at coals, hair full of smoke, trying to look important while everyone else mumbles in their sleep. Keeping fire was more than housework. It was sacred routine disguised as maintenance. Ethnographic studies of Aboriginal Australians, the Hadza of Tanzania, and Arctic reindeer herders show the same unbroken pattern. The communal flame never left unattended. One person, usually the calmest, the patient one, or simply the one who lost the argument, stayed behind to guard it. In some groups, firekeepers were chosen by lineage, believed to possess special connection to the flame's spirit. In others, the job rotated, ensuring that no one escaped the burden for long. Either way, the rule was simple: no fire, no forgiveness. To lose the flame wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. Without fire, meat rotted, tools dulled, predators crept closer. The sun might still rise, but it didn't care about your problems. That's why the firekeeper's failure could become communal legend, whispered for generations, retold with moral overtones about carelessness and divine punishment. Early mythology is full of cautionary tales about those who neglected their duty, tricksters, thieves, or sleepy fools whose embers died, and whose names became synonyms for don't be like that. But firekeeping also carried prestige. In a world that barely survived the night, anyone who could preserve light was already halfway divine. In some early societies, the keeper became a figure of spiritual power, the one who communed with heat, smoke, and transformation itself. The first domesticated flames may have required no belief system, but they created one anyway. Watching something so volatile obey human hands was the first ritual performance, and whoever kept it alive became the priest by default. There's something hauntingly modern in that, too, the way a practical job becomes holy the longer it's repeated. It's easy to see the firekeeper as ancestor to every profession built on vigilance: the nurse, the monk, the sentry, the scientist guarding a fragile experiment from going cold. The principle never changed: protect the glow, or everything falls apart. And even then, vigilance had its limits, because no matter how disciplined the keeper, embers die, wind shifts, accidents happen. And when the fire went out, there was only one solution: someone had to go find another. When the flame finally died, and it always did, life collapsed into a single problem: where to find another spark before the cold remembered your name. In a world without matches, rekindling fire wasn't a skill, it was a quest. Archaeological evidence and ethnographic accounts both suggest that when disaster struck, a sudden storm, a flood, or simple negligence, small groups were dispatched to borrow fire from neighboring camps. They didn't call it diplomacy, but that's what it was: the world's earliest form of foreign relations, conducted in smoke and desperation. Imagine the scene. The hearth goes out before dawn, and everyone wakes to cold ash. There's silence first, then panic. Eyes turn to the horizon, to the unlucky volunteer already being chosen. The traveler leaves with a clay pot or a hollowed piece of wood, carrying a small nest of ash, moss, and hope. The ember must stay alive for hours, sometimes days. Rain is an insult, wind a catastrophe. Each stop along the way means checking, blowing gently, feeding the tiny red coal like an infant that bites. Archaeological findings from prehistoric Europe, the Americas, and East Asia reveal traces of clay fire carriers, portable containers, blackened from within, confirming that this wasn't rare misfortune, but routine. Even in historic times, people in remote villages carried embers wrapped in bark, tucked under cloaks, or kept in shells lined with ash to preserve heat. The Maori word ahika, the home fire burning, became a metaphor for belonging, but it was also literal. If the fire went out, the land was considered abandoned. The connection between flame and identity was that direct. Ethnographies in Central Africa recorded a hauntingly similar tradition. Women carrying glowing coals while migrating, ensuring the group's continuity through a single, breathing ember. Lose it, and you didn't just lose heat, you lost the thread of your ancestors' fire. Each ember was genealogical, a spark of inheritance smuggled through time. There's a strange intimacy in those journeys. The traveler, alone in the landscape, carrying what amounts to condensed civilization inside a pot, blowing into it every few miles to keep it alive. It's absurd and sublime at once, the fragility of human achievement, glowing faintly in a handful of ash. Experimental archaeologists who've tried to replicate the feat report how exhausting it is. One lapse, one bump, and everything's gone. The ember has no mercy and no backup plan. But sometimes, the traveler never found another fire. The night would come down like a verdict, the air heavy, the ember finally dimming in its cradle. And when that happened, people did what they always did when faced with failure. They invented stories to make it meaningful. Across the world, myths arose about those who stole fire, not because they were greedy, but because they'd run out. Prometheus, Mui, Raven, all distant reflections of someone who just didn't want to freeze again. And after enough generations of fumbling with dead coals, humanity decided to do something radical, to stop depending on luck and start making sparks on purpose. Before humans mastered the trick of making fire, they were, essentially, renting it. Every flame in existence was borrowed from a lightning strike, a volcanic vent, or a neighbor who happened to be less unlucky that week. Then, somewhere around 400,000 years ago, someone figured out how to summon it. Not conjure, exactly, just coax a rock and a stick into becoming gods. The earliest spark makers were technicians of chaos. Archaeological finds at sites like Kesim Cave and Sijininsho, flint flakes with scorch marks beside iron pyrite, the prehistoric equivalent of a lighter. Striking the two together produced a glittering rain of sparks. The first visible proof that humans could now manufacture warmth on demand. The only catch, it worked about one time in 50, and only if the weather wasn't mocking you. Then came the friction fire, bow drills, hand drills, fire plows. Experimental archaeologists who've tried them describe the process as a good way to understand despair. You twist, you grind, you sweat, and eventually, if your hands don't fall off, a curl of smoke appears, so faint it seems imaginary. One wrong breath, and it vanishes. Every successful flame must have felt like resurrection. It's no wonder ancient people treated ignition as sacred. It was creation, replayed in miniature. The process demanded ridiculous precision. The wood had to be dry but not too dry, the fiber spun tight but not too tight, and the motion smooth but relentless. You needed to move fast enough to heat, slow enough not to break. It was technology filtered through patience, a miracle achieved by blisters. When the first ember finally appeared, glowing in its tiny cradle of dust, everyone probably stopped breathing. Then came the moment of courage, to blow, to feed that smoldering ghost of potential until, with a sigh, it exhaled into flame. Those who mastered the skill became celebrities, or at least, tolerated specialists. Anthropologists studying indigenous fire-starting traditions still find a deep sense of ceremony in the act. Among the Ainu of Japan, the fire drill ceremony, Ape Matom, was a sacred performance. The spark born from the marriage of male and female would. In Africa and South America, friction fires were used in initiation rituals, their heat symbolizing transformation. To create fire wasn't just practical, it was generative, erotic, divine. But as with every technological breakthrough, the gods of irony were watching. Because once humans learned how to make fire, they also learned how easy it was to lose control of it. The ability to create meant the ability to destroy, a fact written across every burned settlement and charcoal layer in the archaeological record. The miracle and the disaster became twins. Still, the promise of self-made fire changed everything. For the first time, people didn't have to pray for lightning or borrow embers. They could strike their own deals with heat and darkness. The spark, once a fragile accident, was now repeatable, though never reliable. Even then, every ignition carried suspense. Would it catch? Would it live? Would it burn you instead? That tension between awe and terror shaped the next chapter of human imagination, the moment when flame stopped being a mere tool and started becoming a myth. Once humans realized they could make fire instead of waiting for it to descend from the heavens, they didn't celebrate by calling it a chemical reaction, they called it theft. Almost every culture on Earth tells some version of the same story. Fire once belonged to the gods, and humanity, impatient and half-frozen, stole it. It's oddly comforting that our first technological achievement was also our first moral crime. In Greece, Prometheus smuggled flame in a hollow fennel stalk and ended up nailed to a rock for his efforts. A story less about rebellion and more about customer service gone wrong. In Polynesia, Mui tricked the fire goddess Mahuika by begging for her fiery fingernails one by one until she realized she'd been robbed. In the Pacific Northwest, Raven disguised himself to steal fire from selfish spirits who hoarded it underground. And in some Aboriginal Australian tales, women kept fire secret until a nosy man spied on them, stole it, and promptly set the world ablaze. Apparently, the gods weren't the only ones with trust issues. These myths didn't exaggerate humanity's dependence on flame. They explained it. If something could both save and destroy you, it had to belong to someone more powerful than you, and borrowing it required ritual, respect, and a hint of fear. Ignition was never casual. Striking flint or twirling a drill wasn't just physics. It was invocation. Anthropologists note that in many societies, fire-making was accompanied by chants, songs, or taboos, because nothing that volatile should appear without ceremony. Among the Ainu, the creation of fire symbolized sacred union. Male wood and female would join to spark life. In India, Agni, god of fire, was literally the mouth of the gods, the one who carried offerings from earth to heaven. Among the Yoruba, lightning itself was divine fire hurled by Shango, a warning that power always came with collateral damage. The spark was never just heat. It was communication, a divine language that translated human need into smoke. It's easy to laugh now, with our lighters and pilot flames, but the ancient reverence for ignition wasn't naive. They understood something modern people often forget, that making fire was both miracle and gamble. It could feed you or consume you. It could purify or punish. The same gesture that warmed the newborn could erase the village. When everything you owned was flammable, playing with fire wasn't a metaphor, it was a recurring moral lesson. And because humans have a talent for turning caution into ritual, they began reenacting the cosmic theft every time they relit a flame. It wasn't superstition. It was choreography, a way of remembering that civilization itself depended on an act of trespass. Keeping the spark meant honoring its danger. But reverence didn't stop carelessness. Villages burned, forests vanished, and every new settlement became another experiment in the uneasy balance between flame and structure. And so, as people began to live closer, build higher, and sleep under roofs made of dry things, that delicate miracle, the one they once worshipped, became their most efficient destroyer. When humans stopped wandering and started stacking stones, the fire followed them indoors, reluctantly. It had been a creature of open spaces and ash pits, but now it found itself boxed in by mud walls and wooden beams, expected to behave. Settlements sprouted across the Neolithic world, like small experiments in combustion control. Each hearth was both miracle and landmine. Archaeologists can read this duality in the ground, the dark layers of charcoal, the melted clay, the occasional village that looks like someone tried to cook it whole. Take Cataluke in Anatolia, around 7000 BCE, one of the world's earliest cities. Homes were built so tightly that residents climbed in through the roof. Every room had its own hearth, and nearly every room has been found burned. Some fires were deliberate, a ritual cleansing before rebuilding, but others were the predictable outcome of too much faith in kindling and not enough ventilation. Archaeologists still argue whether the city died by accident or enthusiasm. Even the most advanced ancient builders couldn't quite reconcile their need for warmth with their desire not to explode. Early architecture was a paradox: thick walls to hold heat, narrow vents to let smoke out, and that single, stubborn flame flickering in the middle like a ticking clock. One ember too far and the settlement became an inferno. The same spark that turned raw meat edible could, with equal indifference, turn a community into carbon. In ancient Japan, entire wooden cities were rebuilt every few decades because fire simply refused to mind its manners. In Rome, The Great Fire of 64 CE leveled 2/3 of the city, leaving behind enough rubble to fuel both architecture reform and imperial conspiracy theories. In medieval Europe, the phrase "the town burned down" was so routine that chroniclers stopped describing it. Wooden roofs, straw floors, open flames. It was a recipe written by irony itself. Still, people kept rebuilding, often in the exact same spot, sometimes even over the ashes of their previous mistakes. Fire wasn't just tolerated, it was integrated. Every settlement accepted a certain level of combustion as part of its life cycle. A city was considered old when it had burned down at least once. The ruins of one generation became insulation for the next. Even disaster had a purpose. The heat sterilized soil, scared off pests, and cleared space for rebirth. Civilization, it turns out, was a phoenix by design. And through all of this, the hearth remained sacred. To extinguish it was unthinkable. To neglect it, shameful. Archaeologists have found households where people abandoned burning fires when fleeing catastrophe, as if stopping to put them out would be a worse sin than death. The flame's continuity mattered more than the structure it destroyed. It was identity, legacy, and liability, the defining contradiction of settlement life. In the glow of those first clustered hearths, humanity glimpsed both permanence and fragility, the dream of stability built on the edge of annihilation. But the risk didn't end at architecture. Without fire, you didn't just lose your home. You lost your food, your water, your body's equilibrium. Because when the flame died, hunger arrived almost instantly. Without fire, food wasn't food, it was a threat waiting to happen. Cooking wasn't a luxury or a taste preference. It was what separated survival from slow, bacterial suicide. Anthropologists sometimes describe early fire use as culinary innovation, but that's far too cheerful for what it meant. Fire didn't just make things taste better, it made them digestible, safe, and, frankly, chewable. Lose it, and you were one bad meal away from extinction. The moment the hearth went out, the countdown began. Meat spoiled within hours, grain turned inedible, water teemed with invisible betrayals. Fire was the only disinfectant people had, their universal purifier, their primitive pharmacy. It boiled parasites out of water, broke down toxins in roots, softened fiber into food. The anthropologist Richard Wrangham famously argued that cooking was what made us human, that our smaller jaws and larger brains were funded by calories unlocked through flame. In other words, intelligence was cooked, not born. But that gift came with its own curse, dependence. Archaeological sites show that once humans mastered cooking, their entire diet reoriented around it. Hearths became as essential as lungs. At Neolithic campsites, layers of charred bone and grain ash show an almost obsessive attachment to flame. And the minute it went out, through accident, neglect, or whether famine followed like clockwork, a single spark meant the difference between nourishment and rot. Ethnographic accounts of forager societies illustrate how seriously people took this. Among many Arctic and subarctic groups, multiple fires were maintained at once, not for comfort, but insurance. In tropical regions, spare embers were kept in clay pots or buried in ash, a kind of prehistoric emergency kit. Even nomadic families carried live coals from one camp to another, ensuring that no meal ever began from nothing. Starting fire from scratch was possible, but rarely done, too slow, too uncertain. He didn't gamble with hunger. The dependence was so deep, it rewired culture. Sharing fire became synonymous with sharing food, life, and trust. Refusing to share it, on the other hand, was the ultimate cruelty, a denial of survival itself. Across the Americas, Africa, and Eurasia, myths depict greedy figures who hoard flame or food, punished by cosmic justice for trying to privatize warmth. Generosity wasn't virtue signaling, it was thermodynamics. Still, fire's reliability remained fragile. Floods could drown it. Storms could scatter it. One bad decision could strip an entire group of the thing their bodies now relied on. That anxiety never left humanity. It's why so many early rituals center on keeping the fire alive. Perpetual lamps, sacred hearths, temple flames. Beneath the devotion lay something simpler, fear of starvation. And when survival depends so fully on a spark, it's only a matter of time before someone realizes it can also be turned outward, not just as warmth, but as weapon. Because the same flame that roasted roots could roast villages. At some point, humans looked at their perfect little life-saving flame and thought, what if we aimed it at someone else? Fire had already conquered hunger and cold. Conquest itself was the next logical experiment. Archaeological layers from the Bronze and Iron Ages show blackened ruins not caused by accident or bad luck, but by intention. Entire settlements reduced to ash by hands that understood precisely what they were doing. Fire stopped being only a hearth. It became policy. Long before explosives or metallurgy, burning was the simplest, most elegant form of annihilation. You didn't need training, just spite and a good breeze. Scorched earth wasn't a strategy yet. It was common sense. When the enemy lived in thatch and timber, one spark could erase generations. Archaeologists can even track patterns of conquest by the ash lines running through ancient cities. Charcoal fingerprints of revenge. Jericho burned. Troy burned. Most of Europe's early hill forts burned. Civilization, in its adolescence, was an arsonist, and the logic was flawless. The same properties that made fire divine also made it terrifyingly efficient. It multiplied itself, consumed indiscriminately, and lingered afterward as heat and memory. There were no clean battles, no heroic duels, just the sound of dry things realizing too late what progress meant. Fire didn't care whose gods were stronger. It only needed oxygen and opportunity. But its power wasn't merely physical. Burning carried moral theater. To torch an enemy's fields wasn't just practical, it was ritual humiliation. Ancient texts are full of the language of purging and cleansing, as if the flame were not only weapon but judge. When the Hebrews wrote of divine fire smiting sinners, or when Assyrian kings boasted of setting rival cities ablaze, they weren't being poetic. They were performing theology through chemistry. Fire turned politics into revelation. Yet it was also a coward's tool, a way to kill without confrontation. You could flee while your enemy burned, confident that hunger and ash would finish what your courage couldn't. In that sense, every war before the industrial era was part pyromania, part accounting. It was cheaper to light things than to fight them. And humans, thrifty as ever, never wasted a good opportunity to weaponize convenience. Still, for every army that burned, there were civilians who understood the irony more keenly. The same fires that protected their food and families could become their destroyers within minutes. Ancient survivors of conflagrations, from Hittite farmers to Roman townsfolk, left behind layers of fused pottery and melted bronze that still shimmer with horror. Those glowing fragments are time capsules of panic, recording the exact temperature where life turns to archaeology. And so the spark's reputation fractured. It could be divine or demonic, nurturing or vengeful. The only constant was consequence. Humanity had taken its first controlled miracle and turned it loose, and afterward, the collective memory changed. Myths grew darker, proverbs sterner, taboos tighter. The flame that once symbolized warmth began to speak in warnings, because every burned village became a sermon, and every survivor learned the same thing. You never, ever let the spark go unattended. The strange thing about fire is that even when it's gone, it stays. Every culture that's ever touched it carries an echo, a set of rules, myths, and reflexes burned deep into memory. Fear became tradition long before psychology gave it a name. The first time a child reached too close to a flame and flinched, someone probably turned that moment into a story. And those stories spread faster than sparks. Across continents, fire kept its moral double edge. It was the gift that made you human and the punishment that reminded you of it. In Hinduism, Agni is the divine messenger, the mouth of the gods. Yet every ritual begins by asking him not to destroy the participants. In Zoroastrian temples, sacred flames burn continuously, tended by priests who treat them like living beings, feeding them oil and reciting hymns so they don't feel neglected. The Romans did the same with Vesta's hearth. If it went out, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a national emergency. Even the emperor bowed to the virgins who kept it burning, because no amount of military might could restart a flame the gods had abandoned. The fear wasn't paranoia, it was policy. Civilizations learned quickly that neglecting fire meant courting collapse. The ashes of burned cities lingered like trauma in the soil, and the people who rebuilt atop them learned to ritualize caution. That's why never leave a flame unattended might be the oldest safety regulation on Earth. What began as practical survival hardened into etiquette, then into religion, and eventually into law. Among Arctic peoples, fire was never left alone for more than a few breaths. It was believed to have moods. The smoke was the fire's voice, a messenger to spirits. In rural Japan, it was bad luck to extinguish a hearth with water, a symbolic drowning. Among the Yoruba, fire belonged to Shango, god of thunder, and to mishandle it was to invite lightning in return. The lesson was simple but absolute. You could use fire, but never presume ownership. These traditions might sound quaint, but modernity hasn't burned them away. It's just disguised them in bureaucracy. The candles at vigils, the Olympic torch relay, the eternal flames at war memorials, all of them are echoes of that original anxiety. We still fear the dark, still crave continuity, still dress up our dependency as ceremony. Even the glow of a phone screen in a sleeping room, that last, lonely flicker of light before unconsciousness, is part of the same lineage. The flame has just gone digital. Anthropologists often point out that fire was humanity's first tool that could not be touched. You could wield it, shape it, command it, but never hold it. Maybe that's why it never stopped commanding reverence. Every act of mastery contained a reminder of limitation. You could rule kingdoms, build empires, split atoms, but touch a flame for too long, and you're right back where you started. Fragile, flammable, mortal. And even now, after all our technology and arrogance, the flame's authority hasn't faded. We still speak of keeping the light alive, passing the torch, flames of resistance. We still use it to mean life, hope, or rage, the only things that ever really mattered. But before we began naming metaphors after it, fire was something else entirely, a companion, not a symbol or a servant, but a living presence that shared our breath and our nights. Somewhere between survival and superstition, fire became family. It wasn't just warmth or utility anymore, it was presence. In every ancient dwelling that's ever been excavated, from the frozen camps of the Magdalenian hunters to the mud brick houses of Mesopotamia, the hearth sits exactly where the heart should be. Everything else was built around it. The sleeping mats, the tools, the stories, the silences. To be near fire was to be human. To drift from it was to become wilderness again. In forager societies, this intimacy still lingers. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, the fire is kept burning day and night, its glow marking the perimeter between safety and the unknown. People fall asleep facing it, their breath rising with the smoke, an unconscious pact between flesh and flame. Ethnographies noticed something striking. The rhythm of conversation itself changes around firelight. Words slow down, gestures soften, and time becomes elastic. That hypnotic flicker, scientists now say, lowers blood pressure, induces calm, and deepens social bonds, essentially the earliest form of group therapy, minus the hourly rate. For hunter-gatherers, the fire was the tribe's pulse. It dictated movement, marked boundaries, structured evenings. Myths weren't told at midday. They were told at the fire's edge, where faces glowed and shadows performed their own commentary. It was theatre, school, parliament, and confessional, all flickering in amber and ash. Every story ever told was, at some point, a smoke signal rising into darkness. And the relationship wasn't metaphorical, it was caretaking. People fed the fire as they fed children, small portions, often and never neglected. It responded with warmth, light, and an occasional hiss of warning. Many cultures considered the hearth a living being, feminine in Greece, masculine in Japan, dual in Siberia, but always conscious. You spoke softly near it. You apologized if you spilled into it. The line between ritual and respect blurred until they became the same thing. Even in early agriculture, when households grew larger and gods more numerous, the domestic flame retained its dignity. The Greeks lit new fires for weddings. The Romans carried coals from ancestral hearths to new homes, and in ancient China, families kept a small flame burning through the new year to ensure continuity. In the Arctic, where the cold could kill in minutes, the hearth was quite literally the difference between lineage and extinction. There's an eerie tenderness in this dependence. Fire didn't just illuminate faces, it made them visible to each other. Without it, the human world dissolved into outlines. Around it, people learned to speak, sing, weave, and plan. Anthropologists studying cognition suspect that language itself evolved under that glow. When night demanded something quieter than running, and more lasting than fear, fire gave the hours shape. And even now, the instinct remains. Campfires, candles, fireplaces, their nostalgia in flame form, the ancient urge to gather around the only light that ever really felt alive. It's the one companion that never entirely trusted us but never truly left. A reminder that every civilization begins and ends with the same gesture, someone leaning forward in the dark, coaxing a little warmth from a world that's always been too cold.